Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for our discussion on how philanthropic capital can spark 21st century innovations. My name is Melissa Stevens, and I run the Center for Strategic Philanthropy at the Milken Institute. Now, I'm betting I'm probably not alone in this room when I say, when I open my news feed every day, I wish that I saw a little bit more good news. And the royal engagement was a nice distraction as of late, but there's a lot of challenge that we're facing. We have 9,500 diseases for which there are no treatments. We're facing the largest humanitarian crisis since the UN was started. And because of the pressures that humans are exerting on this planet, we're seeing species extinction rates that are 1,000 times greater than ever before. But I promise you, this is not going to be the doom and gloom panel, all right? We're gonna turn this frown upside down. And for me, the salve to these struggles really is two things, in my opinion. One is that we live in a society that believes in innovation, and we're seeing innovation every day. This year alone, we've seen gene editing technologies transform cancer therapies that are having tremendous outcomes for patients. We're seeing a floating wind farm off the coast of Scotland that could have a huge impact on clean energy. And the driverless car has actually gone driverless now. And so in combination with this innovation, we're seeing a tremendous growth in philanthropy and opportunity in philanthropy. We've seen steady increases over the last decade. We're seeing more giving, more large gifts, smarter gifts, and we're seeing philanthropists step up not just with their checkbooks, but they're bringing their business sense, their technology acumen to bear. And so today we really want to talk about two sides of the same coin: is how is philanthropy innovating other sectors, and how are other sectors innovating philanthropy? And I'm really excited to have really an all-star panel here to have this conversation. So on my far right, we have Joe Sorrell, who's Managing Director of Global Policy and Advocacy for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is the largest charitable foundation in the world. And Joe really manages relationships between the foundation, donor countries, NGOs, other foundations, corporations that have missions and interests aligned with the foundation. Next, we have Madeline Clark, who is the chair of the European Venture Philanthropy Association, which is a 200-plus member organization of funders who are interested in venture philanthropy. She's also the founding executive director of Genio, which is an Irish NGO that is really reforming social services, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. To my left, we have Igor Tilchinsky, who is the chairman and CEO of World Quant, which is a quantitative investment management firm that he started in 2007, and we're going to hear a bit how Igor is really innovating both healthcare and education by bringing quantitative analysis to those sectors. And last but not least, we have Johan Elias, who is the chairman and CEO of HEAD, which is the Global Sporting Good Group. And Johan is really passionate about preserving the rainforest, so we're going to hear a bit more about that and the work that he's doing with Cool Earth. So we have a robust range of perspectives to bring to bear here. So I first want to start with a kind of a macro perspective. And Madeline, I'm going to ask you to start us off here, since you have this great 30,000 foot view of the philanthropy space. So tell us a little bit first about venture philanthropy. Define venture philanthropy for us. And is this transition to venture philanthropy, is this evolutionary? Is it revolutionary? How is it better positioning philanthropy to advance innovation?
Okay, well, thank you for the invitation to be here. And maybe just to start by saying what we usually understand as venture philanthropy isn't by any means something that our association has cornered the market on. So really this grew out of the experience of a bunch of VCs who felt that really maybe they should be looking at their giving and donating lives a little bit like they look at their businesses. So maybe to look at providing non-financial as well as financial support to the organizations that they were giving to, tailoring finance to the kinds of needs that the organizations had, looking at things like core funding as opposed to just program funding. So really today what some people refer to as venture philanthropy, which has that combination of long-term core funding, tailored finance, managing and measuring impact alongside actual funds. In other places is called engaged philanthropy, strategic philanthropy. So I think the language can be a little bit confusing. So really what the association I'm chairing is really trying to do is support funders, philanthropic funders, as well as funders who are looking for financial as well as social return to really maximize the impact that they have, and to do that strategically and to do that collaboratively, which is really in the best interest of the people they're trying to serve.
Great. So Joe, I want to ask you to jump in here. You've been in the philanthropy space for some time, and have seen this shift as well. And the Gates Foundation adopt venture philanthropy, and this idea of bringing business practices to philanthropy in the foundation. So tell us a little bit from your perspective the changes that you're seeing, and would love for you to spend a little bit of time talking about how the foundation has changed, has really sort of opened the aperture to do both traditional grant making, but is also using some unique vehicles around program-related investments that are bringing some more different types of financial vehicles to bear.
Yeah, well, thanks, and it's a pleasure to be here. And it's always good to see philanthropy getting a good turnout of people when there's competing panels and other events. The foundation has, and I think still is on a long journey, and it has evolved the way it thinks about philanthropy. When I started in 2001, longer than I care to remind myself, really the object was to find some of the best and brightest organizations out there, figure out ways to allocate capital so that they could extend what they were doing. We took a relatively hands-off approach. We didn't necessarily think about ways to work with other partnerships. It really was giving in a more traditional sense, albeit on a scale that with Bill and Melinda involved, allowed us to do some bigger things and take some bigger bets. I think along the way, one of the biggest changes or practices that we tried to adopt was advocacy, was thinking about beyond our own endowment, which in relative terms was rather large, still is, but in absolute terms really small compared to the amount of giving, whether it's private giving in places like the US, $350 billion a year, or if you think about things like foreign aid at $140 billion a year, our giving was relatively small. So the extent to which we started to think about what are other ways that we could crowd in other sources of capital, how could we influence some of what we were learning to motivate others to perhaps adopt or make better decisions from a policy perspective, that really was, I think, a big moment for us. And so in addition to the grant-making business, we got into the change-making business and tried to think what are ways that we could extend the giving far beyond the foundation's own resources, and that quickly takes you to governments, thinking about how foreign aid could be at least maintained in the levels of giving, but how could it be improved? Could there be a role to try to engage donors in a conversation about how to do it better, how to do it more collaboratively? That's expanded. I started the Gates Foundation's office here in London in 2010 based on this premise that we wanted to get closer to the partners, governments, as well as corporations and other foundations that we were working with. And as you mentioned, there has been, I think, also a sense of what else could we do? What kind of modes of giving beyond grants could we embrace as part of what we do? And program-related investments, PRIs, has become a much bigger part of the foundation's core business. We have a $1.5 billion pool of investments now, of which about $1 billion has been allocated, about 50 or so investments that go beyond just grant making to thinking about equity investments that we could take or guarantees that we could try to provide, again, in partnership with others. And I think that's a really exciting new area for us that allows us to engage with the private sector in a way that we didn't always have that access. I mean, it gives us a seat at the table and allows us to participate and I think deepen the potential impact that we could have. So I think it's a really exciting time, and it's great to see conversations like this and talk about and highlight some of those new modes of giving.
Yep, great, good. We're going to come back to these points around engaging the capital markets, engaging government, which are critical players, especially when we're talking about scaling innovation. But next, I want to turn to you, Igor. Igor, I feel like we could call you the king of Quant, if I may. And your quantitative analysis has really underpinned the success for you at World Quant. Tell us a bit about your journey of arriving at how you wanted to and why you wanted to bring quantitative analysis to your philanthropic work.
Yes, well, for us, since we're so quantitatively oriented, Quant has always been the center of of our focus and of our attention. So when we turn to philanthropy, naturally the thinking was, okay, how do I give financial assistance to certain areas, but also how do I spread the knowledge of Quant to other areas to make them more efficient. And over time, this has evolved. We started out giving out scholarships and such things, and eventually we wound up forming a world's first free online university that offers a master's degree in financial engineering. That's number one. And number two, we formed a joint center for prediction with Weill Cornell Medical Center, where we funded them, but we also cross-pollinate. We send scientists to them, they send scientists to us, and I'll later mention what fruit it has yielded.
That's great, and I just want to sort of punctuate the demand for what you're doing by some of the data that has recently come out looking at the increased demand for highly digital jobs. Right, we're expecting to see a fivefold increase in those, or we saw a fivefold increase in those between 2002 and 2016. So you're helping to create the workforce of the future.
Fivefold increase in high tech jobs and 40% decrease in low-tech job, and our efforts, particularly in World Quant University, are aimed to supply the demand that's there.
Great. So Johan, let's have you jump into this conversation. You're passionate about environmental issues and particularly about preserving the rainforests, perhaps because you're a competitive outdoor athlete, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. But your approach has really been to change the business case around preserving rainforests, so to make sure that the value of a standing tree is greater than the value of a harvested tree. Tell us about how you translate that on the ground. How do you change those financial incentives and the business case for why we should actually be preserving this asset?
Okay. Let me start off by telling you a little story. So in the 70s and the 80s, also into the 90s, there was heavy deforestation in the Congo Basin. That led to rain falling in the wrong places. So agricultural land became non-productive. And what happens then? People that derive their livelihood and food chains change. So people move. That leads to land grabbing. And usually where you have land grabbing, you get conflict. So in Darfur, there was a big conflict. Millions of people died. Another result, as a consequence, was rising food prices. And that was a trigger to Arab Spring. We saw then what happened in Syria, which led to a huge refugee crisis, which was confused with European immigration policy. And whoops, we got Brexit. So you can actually draw a line from deforestation in the Congo Basin to Brexit. And it sounds far-fetched, but it isn't. I actually told this story to Chancellor Merkel about a year ago, and first she laughed, and then she said, actually, you're right. There is a connection. And it's just these tipping points, and these tipping points, what people don't realize is, once you move beyond the tipping points, just not going back. You have to go reset and go back to scratch. And in some cases, that's not possible. So with rainforest, it has such a big impact on food and water security. It has profound impact on the lives of actually billions of people. Unfortunately, it's actually an area which governments and the UN processes have largely ignored, because people are saying it's still there. And paradoxically, the people that focus more on it today are the security and intelligence community, because of these cause and effect, which can result in conflicts. and terrorism as a result of the conflicts. So it is very, very important, and it is something that requires action. So what have I done? Well, I simply identified an area which I was, number one, very passionate about, and number two, having been politically involved for many, many years, I also saw was ignored by the political processes. And I also saw that what we're trying to do in climate change, and I'm not sure climate change is the right description of the challenges that we face. It's actually more about our existence on the planet. Because the planet was not created, or planet was not designed to inhabit 7 billion people living the way we do. So we have to adapt. And sadly, rainforests sort of didn't get priority. It fell very much to the back of the line, and it is an area which requires action. So I started an initiative in the Amazonas. I bought a lot of rainforest, and what I did was, obviously with the intent of protecting it, conserving it, so what I did was to give the harvesting rights to fruits and nuts to the local indigenous population. And the deal was, you can have these harvesting rights for free, but you protect the trees. So that way I turned the poachers into custodians. They started deriving their livelihoods. And this has worked wherever we have done this. Now, buying rainforest in these areas is controversial, because the politicians, they don't like it, because you become a force. You can actually direct people to vote in a corrupt way. Obviously a practice I've never engaged in, but it is something that is sensitive, particularly in a country with corruption problems like Brazil. So we changed that concept, and I was called up by a Labour politician called Frank Field, who said, read about what you do, think it's fantastic, how can we make this available to everybody? So we started Cool Earth, which today has 400,000 members all over the world, and you can donate anything from $1 to whatever you want to give, and it follows exactly the same principle, working with local NGOs, following the same formula. And to date, Cool Earth has protected over 1 million acres of rainforest, South America, in the Congo Basin, and also in Indonesia and PNG.
Great, great. Thank you for sharing that with us. And I want to pick up on this thread of partnership with government. Joe, you teed this up, and Madeline, if you could take this one, because you're doing some really interesting work partnering with government, with your work with Genio, which is helping to really kind of influence policy in their investments. So we're using a small slice of the philanthropy pie to influence a larger slice of funding. If you could tell us about how you're really walking the walk there.
Sure, yeah. So, I think as Joe says, if people really want to, on the private side, create some impact, then it seems a little bit crazy to ignore the very large public spending budgets. And what's most exciting about how we're thinking today is that everybody's thinking about the same problems from their different perspectives. And I think that's really good. So it matters to the business community that there are some safety nets so that people can take risks and get into business. It matters to government that there are philanthropists around and they're learning how to work with them, etc. So within the context of really having spent about 30 years knocking around the human and social service space in various roles, I'm a psychologist by profession, I became very aware of how it is really possible to change people's lives, improve people's lives by improving the services that they're offered. And the people who mainly pay for those services are, of course, governments. So I think all of us know that there is waste, and all of us know that there are pockets of good innovation there as well. So I was interested in seeing, could I demonstrate how philanthropy or private money could act as a catalyst to refocus a large public budget. So this was an experiment that we were very privileged to be backed by a philanthropist who invested quite substantially, and by government who also saw the necessity to do this. So we set about transforming public services and publicly funded services in the disability, mental health and dementia area. Now we're in the homelessness area. And what we were trying to do was drive services so they became really personalised, very customised, so that people got what they wanted, when they wanted, and where they wanted, which is usually in their own homes, in their own doorsteps, in their own communities, rather than being segregated, maybe put into institutions, maybe having to go to nursing home care. So the whole idea was to personalise and really give people what they needed, where they wanted it, and also to use resources cost effectively. We spent 5 years and about 24 million, which we let out on a competitive basis, to find innovators who could do this really well. And we spent quite a lot on proving the concept then, and we didn't know it was going to be proven at the time, but investing in universities to gather the evidence, which actually did show that if you personalise social services and use those resources very cost effectively, that you will make savings that will help you meet the needs of the demographic trend that is coming towards you. We're now in the much bigger, more difficult space of scaling, so we're now managing a 45 million fund. Again, we let it out competitively. The rate of turn down is, maybe 1 in 5 proposals we don't fund. But to an earlier point that was made, we know that money doesn't solve problems on its own. So alongside this, we're capacity building, training people, funding other people where we can to do the training, and gathering the evidence, so that within each field, we're moving towards early innovation and then scaling that so that larger populations of need are reached. And that is the really tricky bit, because that is the challenge in innovation. We're investing massively in innovation hubs and incubators and competitions, all good, but we have so many solutions that we know will work. The problem is, how do you get those scaled? And in the social sector, that is through governments, and it's through working with governments.
Mm-hmm. So Joe, would love for you to piggyback on that and talk a little bit more about your partnership with governments. What are really the success factors? What does each side need to bring to the table to make a successful partnership between the foundation and the government? And what are some of your lessons learned?
Well, I think these public-private partnerships come in lots of different forms, and it gets to what each side can bring to the table. Some of the ones that I've been involved with and the foundation has been engaged in have to do in the areas of global health. One example that's fairly recent is in the issue of family planning. And Melinda Gates is really put family planning as one of the top priorities of her role at the foundation. And in 2012, the foundation, along with the UK government, convened a number of governments and partners from around the world to really try to solve the problem that more than 200 million women globally lack access to routine contraception. And we set a goal to say we're going to close the gap by 120 million women by 2020. One of the big challenges was trying to figure out what are the kinds of contraceptive devices that women most want, and why aren't they getting to women? And one of the most in demand are implants. Mm-hmm. And the biggest problem with when we looked at this was price and access. Mm-hmm. You've got a really fragmented market such that manufacturers couldn't really predict or accurately forecast what kinds of markets they could sell to, and so governments got together and with the pharmaceutical companies said, look, what if we could provide a set of guarantees? So working with the government of Sweden, working with Norway, the Children's Investment Fund Foundation based here in the UK, several other partners said, look, if we provide this guarantee, could we negotiate a lower price? And a couple companies, in particular Bayer, known by Americans like myself as Bayer, but Bayer said that they would reduce the price of their implant from $18.50 to about $8. And another company, Merck, came in and lowered its prices by 50%, created a 5-year agreement that they would offer those prices. And as a result, in just 3 years, 26 million more implant devices are now going to the 69 countries that were identified as the places where we really wanted to close the gap, that 200 million gap of women who don't have access to contraception. And it's saved a total of about $250 million in 3 years alone. So it's an example of how governments can come together with philanthropic organizations, work in a way that really leverages the innovation, the access, that companies can bring in a way that will, at the end, help more people live healthy, productive lives.
Yep, great. Igor, let's talk a little bit about your partnership with not a government, but an academic institution. So you're partnering with Weill Cornell
Yes.
Medicine, and again, you're bringing funding, but you're bringing this cross-fertilization of ideas, and you're bringing human capital and intellectual capital to this, and really redefining how we diagnose and treat disease, but also how we could predict and prevent disease. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, well, we have exchanged people, and the people have exchanged ideas, and a lot of interesting things have come out of it. Typically, it involves an algorithm, and some examples are, I think, fertility was mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
We help to increase fertility by providing algorithms that predict in vitro fertilization. So that's one effort that has come out already. We provide deep learning algorithms to NASA in spacemen. What do you call them? Astronauts. Yeah. Okay. Which monitors their health and does DNA sequencing in space. We have been responsible for creation of 3 startup companies, and 10 more in the pipeline. And there's also been a study done across 75 cities for antibiotic resistance. And out of that, we've come up with algorithms that are predictive in nature and help predict which drugs will fight the different germs in the different places. So that's what we came up with, and it's just a beginning because the partnership is not very old, and we're going to do much more. So this cross-fertilization idea is very good. When you take knowledge from one industry and you inject it into another industry, you get really great benefits. And charity doesn't have to be simply about financial aid. It has to involve more, and
Yep.
we provide more.
Yep. Great. So, Johan, you heard a couple of advocates for why the pros for working with government. You're working independent of government, but you are working with the local communities. So tell us how you've made that successful, and how you've had to take kind of a holistic approach to sort of building those communities.
Well, let me first say that I think governments are doing great in many areas, but there are areas where the institutions that have been set up or that are dealing with issues were actually not set up for the purpose that we're trying to use them for today. And one very good example of that is, in fact, climate change, because the UN was set up for different purpose. The World Bank was set up for different purpose. UNEP and UNDP for different purposes. Yet these organizations have a very strong involvement with the process. But not necessarily all the competences are there, and not necessarily can they actually have the desired impact. So with the area of climate change, I'm a believer that can only happen with corporate engagement, and all of us. It's not only politicians. The politicians can facilitate, but in the end, real change will come from people, education of people, corporations behaving in a more socially responsible manner, and that is how we can make things happen. In my particular case with rainforests, there is a particular lack of organizations that can be effective in this area. And having had direct experience with those organizations and continuing to do so, I so see the need for private involvement. And it's the only way that we can affect change.
Great. So we've planted the seeds for a few different types of partnerships and want to cover a few more before we leave this topic. And one is around partnerships with the capital markets. And so, Madeline, I know one of the trends you've sort of identified is structures that are allowing billions of philanthropy to tap into the trillions of the capital markets. Tell us about some of the structures that are particularly exciting to you, and what are the tailwinds, but some of the headwinds that are being faced right now as well.
Yeah, so I think we're all aware of the growing trend of impact investment, and the idea that people can do good while they're doing well is such a it's such a compelling notion, and it does break down that barrier between that traditional, the good and the greedy, which is no longer a barrier that really is in existence, particularly for younger generations coming up. So I think we do have the possibility now of philanthropy tapping in, not just in terms of the way they invest their own endowments, but in connecting up with other kinds of investments. So the idea that philanthropy can come in and give that patient capital, can back that innovation, can create a safe space even to fail, that's really, really important. So that at that end of the continuum, where you really need to explore what is a good way to do this, or indeed the kind of role that Joe has described there of convening. So the fact that you're not looking for financial advantage means that you have such credibility and a capacity to convene and bring people together. And then, of course, once the solutions that are invented, are created, can be helped to become investable solutions, either through scaling by government or through the private sector, where there's a market that becomes created for it, or in whatever way. And I mean, sometimes scaling is through open source. I look at Wikipedia. Sometimes it's, we need to think much more broadly about the way we scale and the way we get innovations out to people that really need them. So tailoring finance doesn't just mean picking, grants or, buying equity or whatever. It can be a continuum of grants to convertible grants, to loans, to equity, to a lot of different ways of thinking about what's the way to finance this impact strategy. What's the way to finance this collaborative or this organization or this collection of organizations to come together? And there's much more sophisticated thinking now, I think, coming to bear in creating not just single mechanisms, but a range of mechanisms that connect up together and give everybody what they want. The philanthropist impact, an exit strategy, the investor return, and also feeling good about how they're making their money. So I think it's one of those win-win situations if we just get the blend right.
Different horses for different courses.
Absolutely,
say, right?
and different risk appetites, different interests there.
Yeah. And Joe, I saw a lot of head nodding. So anything else you'd like to add to that?
No, I think you articulately, put out a pretty good case for why there should be a lot of optimism. And I love this idea of financial engineering. I think too often it's gotten associated with with bad deals in 2008 or something, but I do think there needs to be more creativity brought to this space to think about ways to combine what can sometimes be what in the past were competing agendas, but now can be brought together. And I think the role of philanthropy in particular, because of its ability to be patient, to be less risk averse than say, private sector funding or government funding, makes it, puts it in a space of being, really valuable and unique. And so I think some structures, whether it's philanthropy putting up capital to take some of the first losses, or I think, as you started, Melissa, this idea that some of the innovation cycles sometimes do get broken because there is adversity in the marketplace for investing in high risk, high reward ideas. I mean, it's a perfect place for philanthropy.
Yeah, great. So Joe, I want us to stay with you for a little bit and talk about how we scale through partnerships between philanthropists. And recently we saw the launch of Co-Impact, which is a $500 million collaborative between philanthropists that are really looking at some large systems change, focused in education, health, and economic opportunity. So I was hoping you could speak a little bit to that and the opportunity for philanthropists themselves to come together in a more coordinated way and move beyond just co-investing, which was great for Warren and Bill, but how do we actually bring networks, expertise, and co-funding together? Is this a new model going forward?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't help but mention one initiative that we're really excited about, and that's the Giving Pledge. That's something that Warren and Bill and Melinda started a few years ago. The idea being that they wanted to try to get as many philanthropists, uber wealthy individuals, to commit more of their wealth, 50% of their wealth, in their lifetime or at their death. And we're up to, I think, 170 some families now, and 21 different countries represented. And so I think it is more of creating a culture of philanthropy where the expectation and, if not responsibility, to give back, I think is something that initiative has really, I think, triggered a lot of good dialogue around. It's not an investors club. I think there are partnerships that come of that when some of those giving pledgers come together annually and talk about lessons learned in their philanthropy. One of the things that Bill and Melinda used to always talk about, which really frustrated them, was when they would get together with other individuals of significant means, and people would say to them, I'm very certain, I feel good about what's going on in the business world, I feel good about what's going on in my personal life. My philanthropy is one of the most frustrating things that I have going on, because I never really know am I having the impact? Are we really getting good value? And I don't really understand. And so I think these kinds of convenings and having that kind of ability to get together with others and talk about some of those lessons learned provides a bit more of that richness. I think there are now other efforts, you mentioned one with Co-Impact, that are trying to take a more deliberate approach to say, look, and that is really focused on systems change, where in addition to interesting one-off projects, there really are identified ways in education and in health, a couple of other areas, where we really have done enough of our homework to understand what are the solutions that, if funded at scale, could have a really meaningful impact. So I think there's a huge amount that could be done. I think it does start with making sure that culture of giving is improved, that the quality of then giving improves, and giving more givers. I mean, people in this room have probably seen the numbers, the trillions that will be handed down, passed down in families over the next generation is enormous. And I think it really provides an amazing opportunity if the quality is raised and people have the resources to think about bigger problems and taking them on in a new and different way.
Yep, great. All right, and we're going to come back to this topic of building the philanthropy ecosystem. But Madeline, another question for you is the trends that you're seeing. We've talked a little bit about how on the financier side, on the investor side, right, there's some new structures. But let's talk about on the investee side, and the nonprofits themselves are looking to take pages out of the for-profit book. How is that working out?
I think in some respects it's working out really well, and then sometimes I think we have an over-application. So you've got to remember that there's always an uneven relationship between people who have money and who don't have money. So whatever the people that have the money say usually gets attention. And because people who have money and have been successful in getting money and want to do some good with it are faced with nonprofits that, let's face it, they don't respect in the same way. So like, to caricature all of this, you have got private sector people who look at non-profit people as kind of really good people, do-gooders, but essentially losers who wouldn't hack it in the world that we live in. I think, if we were really honest, I think the
present company excluded.
This is a caricature. I did preface it by saying that, and I think equally, you have the private people looking at the government people saying, I don't really want to deal with them. I don't want to shore up the gaps that they're leaving because they're not efficient, and essentially they're pen pushers that are kind of heading towards their pensions, and they're not going to be very innovative. And I think interestingly, the government people look at the philanthropists often and say, oh my God, whose desk will I land this relationship on to manage? What mess will these people make out there in the space that I have responsibility for when they walk away? So we're not all blessed with a Gates Foundation approach where you're very strategic and you do very well. There are philanthropic initiatives that really, really cause a lot of difficulties. I come from a small country. Like many other countries in the developed world, we have a problem with youth suicide. We now have more groups challenging, NGOs that are trying to combat youth suicide than we have young people committing suicide in the country every year. And why is that? Because we have really nice people who are putting their hands in their pockets and very unstrategically trying to help. So I think there is lots of room for us to do better and to do that in a more, in a more collective way. I'm not sure if I've answered your question, Melissa. What was the core of your question again?
You answer it, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I've ticked the box.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's bounce back over to Igor. You've talked a little bit about your work in the healthcare space. Let's hear a little bit more about your work in the education space with World Quant University and the organization that you've set up there, and really are filling a market need in terms of bringing financial engineering education, making that more accessible, and distributing opportunity globally for this type of education.
Yes, thank you. So in the education field, our master in the financial engineering program is now, in terms of enrollment, the largest such program in the world. So I consider it a success. Not only that, 50% of enrollment is in Africa and emerging countries, and 50% is in developed countries. And as you know, there are different standards for education in these two spheres. In more developed countries, there's more emphasis on creativity. In the more emerging countries, there's more emphasis on pragmatic skills. So the fact that we're able to find a strong demand in both types of markets signifies that we've hit on something. There's a strong undercurrent of demand for this type of education. And the 1,300 that we have, which by the way is spread out through 80 countries, it's just a beginning. We're going to reach multiples and multiples of this number.
Great. So I want to come back to this idea of building the philanthropy ecosystem. And Johan, you are working to replicate your model, or allow others to replicate your model by building the Cool Earth Toolbox and really allowing others to beg, borrow, and steal what you've already done. So you had this realization early on that it would be no need to recreate the real wheel. Let's have others use what we've learned. So can you talk a little bit about what you're doing through Toolbox, and how do we promote more sharing of what's worked and what hasn't worked, frankly?
Well, it's basically you share knowledge with people. You know what formulas work. You know things that doesn't work. So, for instance, we know it's a bad idea to try to pick a fight with corrupt politicians because it just delays things. So, where that environment exists, we don't do things. We know that we have to work closely with the indigenous population in the area. We also know that sometimes we have to complement with things like medical care, education. So for instance, we have barges that go up and down the river with libraries and computers with internet connection so that people have access to learning. So it's not, the basics are the same wherever you go. And there are some modifications depending on where you are. That's how I would best describe it. Now, we tried to do that with a protocol called reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, which is a very fancy term for exactly the same thing. That was adopted as a UN protocol. And this illustrates where governments, world organizations, doesn't have the ability to be as effective. Because rainforest economics, it's that simple. You have to make the standing tree more valuable than the cut down one. As simple as that. So instead of, which I was very much a contributor to, writing 500 pages of backing up with research sources and so forth, it's very nice. But it's not going to produce the practical results. They can only be achieved by doing things in a very simplified manner where you don't have many stumbling blocks. And that is what I try to do, and that is what Cool Earth has been very successful in rolling out wherever we go.
Yeah.
Why? Because it's simple.
Yeah. So, Madeline, talk a little bit about what you see as being the importance of sharing successes, sharing failures. You know, we had some discussion this morning about this, and light bulbs going off over, overheads. How do we promote more of this?
So I think we have to do this a bit more deliberately. So I mean, connecting it back to that point about what's good that we've brought in from the private sector. So the focus on outcomes measurement, robust measurement, customer focus, all that's really great, But when it comes to trying to scale some of these solutions in the social area, the dynamics that operate in the business world don't actually operate in this area. So you have to deliberately try and scale these. So we were talking about this earlier and saying, if you're in a different area. So the example I was using was, if somebody discovers a cure for breast cancer, it's in the Lancet the next morning. We all know about it. We all want it. We're all waiting for access to it where we need it. If we discover a solution to one of these big social challenges, it's not necessarily known by all of us, and it's certainly not necessarily invested in the way that it needs. So I would say that the challenges that we are facing because we're all getting older, depending on fewer, the homelessness crisis, homelessness is a great example. So we know, and we have the evidence that the antidote to homelessness is homes. If you give people homes and you tailor supports around them so that they maintain their tenancies, even if they experience long-term and enduring homelessness, it works. It works for 85% of the most difficult cohort of homeless people. And it's called Housing First. But we're not doing it everywhere. Why are we not doing it? So I think we need some overarching mechanism that's beyond getting 70 or 80 or 100 people together at a time to pitch to investors. That's nice. People enjoy it. But we really need to find, and it's a design challenge, we need to find a way to design some forum or some platform or some mechanism so that if somebody discovers a really smart way that is transferable to different operational environments, that we all know about it very quick, and we short-circuit that duplication that's creating so much waste all over the place, so that we get into, and that's what's going to move, I think, social innovation out of the second class that it's in at the moment, right into the centre, because we will then be able to really look and no more have excuses not to be investing in these solutions at scale.
Great.
I rest my case.
Adjourned. So we're going to go to questions in a moment, so put your thinking caps on. But Joe, invite you to respond to this as well. What do you see as being the capacity and ecosystem needs to really create learning communities within philanthropy? What are the other infrastructure tools, et cetera, do we need to promote more of this knowledge sharing?
Well, I think we need better analytics. I mean, I do think that there are a number of convenings. I'm sure we've been to, this is another one where sharing best practices and sharing some of the case studies about what works. I think this is good. And I think that access to better data and better analytics will, I think, allow us to really hone some of those. I think we need to figure out ways to really make the case. When we think about governments, there's a real stress right now going on, and I think a real competition for limited resources, and figuring out ways that to governments you can really make the case that some of the solutions are in fact cost effective, they're tested. In this country, making the case for foreign aid is very difficult right now, and I think there's a high bar and a high degree of skepticism that that's challenging to get across, but the need still exists. So finding ways to I think, do that in a compelling way are really important. And I do think some of those places those convening places will come in different situations. If there is a crisis in trying to figure out how to make markets work better for the poor in poor countries on healthcare, I think getting those conversations gathered. I think about the role of countries like Canada. I see the Deputy High Commissioner here. Canada has, at one point noticed that there's this proliferation of interesting ideas around impact investing and lots of different enthusiasm, but help set up a marketplace to really vet some of those ideas and say, let's come together in one place to figure out what is working, what's scalable, where is that interest? And I think that, more of that will be needed, and I think will be good to separate those interesting, cool ideas that are fun to talk about at conferences like this, and actual scalable ideas that really do need those resources.
Right. And they're not mutually exclusive.
That's right. That's right.
So we can't mention big data and analytics without inviting you, Igor, to comment. How do we bring more analytics to the philanthropy space?
Well, the data is there. It's just a question of analyzing it. So I think the best way is, just like we went through a partnership with Weill Cornell, and we helped them to get more analytical. We have to form partnerships with other organizations and work together to get all this information out of the data, because data is just data. It's the information in it that makes it useful.
Right. Makes it knowledge, makes it wisdom.
Wisdom.
Right. Great. So we have a few minutes for questions. So questions in the audience? And we've got a mic coming to you.
Thanks. It's Steve Podmore. I just have a very practical question. At these kind of events, but also throughout all of your lives, you get pitched. I'm sure every day, lots of people coming to you with an exciting project. And some of them are systemic, some of them are well thought out, some of them are terrible. How do you filter currently with efficiency? And how do you know what to look at, spend your time, what to push to someone else, which often isn't that good, because everyone wants to pass the parcel. What do you spend your time on? How do you filter what's good, what's not? That's it.
Who wants to take that?
Yeah. We'll do it differently, I would say. The way we've been doing it in this particular experiment, and which I think is transferable, is to let a fund out on a competitive basis against criteria that we've developed with the end beneficiaries. So we look at what's the population we're trying to help here, what matters most to them, and let's define criteria for spending against what matters most. And then we run competitive processes so that providers come in and they pitch. And if they're not doing what the end beneficiaries really want, that's it. It needs to be sustainable, it needs to configure public resource, et cetera, et cetera. And the other way we filter is not to invest completely in service provision. So I think all of us are very caught up with the supply side, providing programs, providing projects, providing services is really good. But then there's the demand side, and animating the demand amongst people who actually don't have any voice is quite a challenge. So we have different criteria for that. But I think you probably have lots of different ways of doing this depending on your strategy. So Joe would be a better...
Yeah, we get pitched a lot.
I bet.
Lots of people who come. I think for an organization like Gates, where the strategies are pretty well formed, we're looking for gaps that we can fill, ideas that are pretty specific. We know we need to figure out over time a way to detect tuberculosis well before symptoms manifest. It's a specific part of our strategy. And so it tends to actually, I like to say we're focused to a fault, or I've gotten a habit of saying that. I don't like to say that because, you're in the business of saying no 90+% of the time. That said, for things that are on strategy, we look to, is the idea a good one? If it's an upstream idea, is the science good? If it's a downstream idea, is the idea scalable to a large number of people? I mean, we tend to try to focus on radical transformation and things that are really going to have big impact at scale. Is it cost effective? Is it sustainable from a long-term financing perspective? Meaning, is there an exit strategy for an entity like Gates so that you're not in it forever, but there's some way to once proven, try to find a government or another entity to try to sustain it. I mean, those are the kinds of questions that I think ours and other institutions go through every day.
Great. And down here.
Hi, so my name's Nadia and I work for governments and INGOs, and I work for think tanks as well. And I think I'm going to ask a controversial question: that do you think that there's a role in charities to repackage the question? So, for example, if we collect data, perhaps we're looking at the wrong we're looking at for the wrong results, and we should be thinking about the money that can be saved by saving a tree, not by the damage that's done by deforestation. And this can go across the board, and also just extrapolating lessons that, a project that can be done in a fragile country can be extrapolated to other countries. So, because the only way something will be sustainable is if it's taken nationally, and ultimately you have to have multilateral conversations to make that international. So these are really, really, really big questions. And I've worked for some amazing INGOs, but essentially we kind of start working with each other, and we go for grassroots organizations, and it's really amazing and really great romantic stuff. But the scalable push keeps coming in there, we need to get more philanthropists on board, and we'll work with this partner and that partner. But unless the governments take it on board and realize they're going to save money, forget about how much money we're pumping in, they just don't get adopted. And this is something charities do again and again and again.
I think the mistake is often that people do the invention and the building up of the argument and the demonstration outside government. And it's not, I think any of us who are in government or work with government people know that the biggest frustration they have is somebody coming to them with a brilliant new idea, a cost-effective way of meeting the needs of a population they have legislative responsibility to respond to, and all their money is tied up over here. And anybody knows that reform and refocusing that money means taking something away from somebody to give it to somebody else, i.e. political fallout, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where I think the most promising trends that I've seen are where the private, whether it be philanthropy or private investment or both, they have the sense to have the conversation at an early enough stage with government, so that they're not trying to get government to own or adopt something that they have no ownership for because they weren't involved in that conversation. And where they use the clout that they have to say, we're not going to give you this money, we're not going to invest in solving this problem that you have responsibility for and feel responsibility for, unless you agree to give us an exit strategy and sustain and scale it. And I think that power of private money is very underused. People go with, as we say in Ireland, a Hail Mary approach. Please adopt me, even though you've never met me before, because I'm brilliant. And I've proven that I'm brilliant, and that just doesn't work,
Anything to add, Joe?
No, I agree with a lot of your points. I think I know from my own experience working at the Gates Foundation, we oftentimes, not surprising given our benefactors, believe that technology harness could benefit the lives of millions of people. It still remains the fundamental principle for us. But I think innovations don't introduce themselves. You really do have to kind of innovate with the end user in mind. And I think that's taken us to be much more thoughtful about how we show up in the countries where we're hoping some of this change happens. It led us to open offices in Africa where we said we never would do it because we wanted to kind of stay really nimble, stay really small. But you really have to get to know the context in which you're working and know if the stuff that you're actually funding is will have a chance of being taken up in a serious way. And that means having relationships at multiple levels across the country, with civil society, with governments, with the private sector, and really understand context much better. And so that's been a fundamental. So I agree with the premise of the argument that sometimes it's sort of some of this planning and good stuff happens in absence of that context and understanding, what it takes to make change. And I think you're seeing more response based on that.
So we're down to just a couple of minutes, so we're going to go into our lightning round question here, and we'll start this end with Johan. Where and in what manner should philanthropic capital be invested to reap world-changing dividends? Though I think I know your answer.
Of course, in the rainforest. No, but getting back to your topic, for instance, how do I select things that I give money to? It's all about things that I have knowledge about. And I think that's much easier. So if it's rainforest projects, of course, simple. I can see immediately if it's good or bad. The other thing I look at is how much does an organization spend on overheads? And if they spend more than 10% of what they get in on overheads, then I think there is something wrong. They, as an organization, are not sustainable. So therefore, they are probably not a good organization to work with.
Though
You
some
have-
would say they're investing in their human capital,
Yes, but
which would take us into a whole other session.
yes,
So
but that is not why we're giving money. We're giving money because we want to see it having impact, not to educate people in positions. Although it's very important, but that is not. It's not the cost-efficient way of educating people.
Yep. So let's move to, since we're almost out of time, Igor.
I think in the case of Quant, there is a lot of payback that can be achieved by applying quant methods to different areas. So it almost pays to invest the money to hire two or three more people that you would then place within a host organization to spread the knowledge instead of simply giving capital.
All right, Madeline, world-changing dividends.
World-changing dividends,
Yeah.
I think, is to value the contribution of all of the elements. So not to be dazzled by the newest trend. The newest trend on the investment side is the impact investing. Wonderful idea and has a wonderful place. But in fact, my concern is that the claiming on the basis of impact investing at the moment is leading to a cynicism, which would be rather a pity because it is a wonderful idea. So I think it's important to value that, but alongside all of the other elements. On the investee side, I think we have a huge push towards social enterprise. So let's make everybody that has chosen not to be in business become a business and innovate while they have to earn their salaries, put a roof over their head and do everything else. Would we do that in the business world? No. So I think we have to be really, really careful about respecting the contribution of all of these strands and much smarter about bringing the relative contributions and distinctive contributions together to make big change in a collaboration.
So Joe, where would you invest for world-changing dividends? And you thought you got pitched before. Just wait till after.
Well, let me say two things. One is what Madeline just said about impact investing. I think watch this space for institutions like Credit Suisse, getting serious people in charge of looking at this issue in a much bigger way than a smaller part of the organization. Serious people like Michael Milken. I think it's a fantastic opportunity. I'd say in terms of the breakthrough investment, I'd look outside of the Gates Foundation and say energy. In Bill Gates' spare time, he focuses on sustainable energy. In 2015, got 20 countries to commit to doubling their energy R&D, and a bunch of investors together to say, once some of that promising upstream research is done, how can we take some of the most promising of those and really think about new solutions to energy? The conference next week in Paris will be a good opportunity to expand. So watch next week. I think there's going to be some really great developments in the sustainable energy space soon.
Good. All right. Well, I promised we would end up in a good place. It was not doom and gloom. Our frown turned upside down. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And please join me in thanking our panelists.